began with a sky the color of old iron. Clouds clung to the mountaintops of the Vale, heavy and brooding, as if they carried all the sorrows of a world about to be torn in two. A single raven, black wings beating, soared through the chill air. It brought a letter, sealed with the dire wolf of House Stark, to the Aeries' lofty perch. Within those walls, uncertain hearts weighed its words, and the fate of the 7 kingdoms trembled at a single decision. In a land defined by prideful lords, ancient feuds, and fear of entanglements, seldom had the Vale so faced a moment as pivotal as this one. No lesser man than Eddard Stark, once brother-in-law to Lysa Arryn, languished in the Red Keep's dungeons on charges of treason against King Joffrey Baratheon. The news had arrived piece by piece. The death of King Robert, the ascension of his supposed son, and the condemnation of the late king's dearest friend in hand. In the north, Robb Stark had called his banners, a boy forced into manhood by the iron jaws of war. The young wolf had mustered his armies at Moat Cailin, sworn swords loyal to the Stark name, ready to march south to free their lord and father. But the Vale was quiet at first. Lord Nestor Royce held the gates of the moon under Lysa Arryn's regency for young Robert Arryn. Bronze Yohn Royce and the other proud lords of the Vale, men who had fought on foreign fields and known the taste of steel, chafed at Lysa's reluctance. Protected by the impregnable fortress of the Eyrie, she had insisted that the Vale remain neutral, safe behind its mountain passes. Yet war does not heed high walls, nor does it bow to pleas for peace. At first, Lysa clutched to her stance of neutrality. She had refused to send knights or men-at-arms to aid her late husband's friend, for fear that Lord Tywin Lannister's wrath would spill over into her domain. But a letter had arrived in the talons of that black-winged raven, bearing both the direwolf seal and a personal plea. Lady Lysa, in the name of honor and justice, I beg you to join our cause. If the Vale stands with the North, we might deliver my father from captivity and ensure the realm does not fall to a tyrant. House Arryn and House Stark have long stood side by side. The memory of Jon Arryn, your beloved lord husband, and the brotherhood he shared with my father and King Robert still resonates across the 7 kingdoms. Do not let that bond fade. The words were signed simply, Robb Stark, with no regal flourish, though all rumored that his men already called him king in the north. In her chambers, Lysa paced. Her nerves were ragged. Robert, her sickly son, dozed fitfully in the next room. The letter trembled in her hand. The Vale was not powerless. The Knights of the Vale had a reputation for skill, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. If joined with the North, they would form a formidable alliance. Could they break the Lannister hold on King's Landing? Perhaps, but it was not merely that risk which haunted Lysa. She knew her secrets, the hidden truths behind Jon Arryn's death, and how precarious her position truly was should any major house pry open that closet of lies. Fear guided her every step, yet her own lords pressed. Yohn Royce arrived to speak with her, as did Lyn Corbray, Ser Vardis Egan's brother, and many others who recalled the memories of Jon Arryn's friendship with Eddard Stark. They claimed that turning a blind eye to the Stark cause would shame the Vale. Their armor glinted in the thin mountain sunlight, their swords whispered out of scabbards anxious for rightful cause. She realized that refusing them might spark a quiet rebellion, or perhaps a not-so-quiet one. That very night, she told Lord Nestor Royce that she would support the North for the sake of her son's future, and for the sake of her late husband's memory. She scribbled a quick note, pressed her personal seal upon it, and handed it to him, instructing that it be read to the assembled knights, but not shared with those outside the Vale. She wanted to appear cautious still, but within her walls all illusions collapsed. The Vale of Arryn would take up arms in the name of House Stark. Morning found the Vale astir with motion. The Aeries' storied high hall echoed with the ring of steel, the whinny of horses, and the thunder of new purpose. Flocks of ravens were released, wings beating frantically as they flew to Gulltown and smaller ports with orders to muster ships, men, and supplies. The formidable fortress that had once harbored only the quiet tears and tremors of Lysa's private grief now burst with an energy that threatened to wake the slumbering spirits of long-dead Arryns. The first to rally were the Royces. Bronze Yohn Royce, an imposing figure with runic bronze armor said to carry the old magic of the First Men, knelt before Lysa and swore to defend her son. But in the same breath, he demanded that the Vale's armies march to Moat Cailin to join Robb Stark's gathering forces. The Graftons, the Corbrays, and the Waynwoods followed suit, spurred by a feverish sense of loyalty and, perhaps, thirst for glory. Word traveled. Far below in the green valleys, knights mounted their war horses. Men donned steel plate, fletchers stacked arrows into crates, and fisherfolk loaded ships with salted meat. Gulltown's port bustled with life it had not seen in decades. Newly refurbished ships set sail, flying the Falcon and Moon banner. From across the Vale came thousands of men, some old warriors from Robert's rebellion, others fresh-faced squires eager to prove themselves on a battlefield that would shape their names. Soon the Vale had become a swirling center of activity, forging alliances within alliances. A skilled few even whispered that if the Vale moved swiftly, they could potentially help free Lord Eddard Stark before any harm was done. But the message from King's Landing was already dire. Ned Stark awaited trial, or worse. Rumors said that the boy king on the Iron Throne, under the influence of his mother, Cersei Lannister, might show Ned Stark no mercy. Yet to the Vale Lords, the chance to strike first and strike fast proved tempting. Lysa agreed to dispatch an envoy to Moat Cailin to treat directly with Robb Stark. She named Ser Brynden Tully, her uncle and the famed Blackfish, as the envoy's leader, a man of cunning and experience, who had parted from Riverrun in angered dissatisfaction but never wavered in loyalty to family and to justice. Brynden Tully wasted no time. He gathered a score of knights, among them Ser Donnell Waynwood and Ser Lynn Corbray. Though Lysa disliked the latter for his unpredictable temper, they set out by way of mountain passes that few armies could traverse without the Vale's goodwill. The trip was fraught with precarious switchbacks and steep drops, but these were men and women accustomed to life in the heights. They traveled swiftly, guided by the moonlit peaks, arriving in the Riverlands before word of their approach could spread widely. All the while, Robb Stark's host had begun to stir in the north. At first, he gathered Lords Umber, Karstark, Serwyn, Manderley, Tallheart, and Bolton. Thousands of men, their breath steaming in the cold morning air, gathered under Stark banners. Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, prowled at his side. Together, they prepared to cross the Neck, that swampy expanse that separated the north from the southern kingdoms. News reached Robb of the Vale's impending support just as he deliberated with his bannermen on the best way to deal with the twins belonging to Walder Frey. Delighted yet cautious, Robb sent back his own letter urging all haste but also caution. There was no sense in trying to rescue Lord Eddard by storming the city if the Lannisters had the capital secured. Instead, perhaps uniting their forces could let them crush Tywin Lannister's field army or force a negotiation. In a stroke of fortune, the Blackfish met Robb Stark outside Moat Cailin itself, the ruin that guarded the causeway into the north. It was a homecoming for Brynden in more ways than one, for though he was of House Tully, the Eyrie and Riverrun were connected through his ties of blood. He found the northern host bristling with tension, the men eager for war. Catelyn Stark was there, pacing quietly alongside her son, giving counsel where she could. She, too, was relieved to see her uncle. Perhaps the Vale's pledge would be the difference between heartbreak and hope. In a large command tent, Brynden Tully stood opposite Robb Stark, who looked younger than Brynden had expected. His voice was level, though, and behind his youth burned a fierce resolve. Grey Wind's amber eyes glinted in the torchlight. Catelyn hovered nearby, relief softening her features at her uncle's arrival. They spoke in hushed voices, forging plans that would soon upend the balance of power in the Seven Kingdoms. The Vale will bring some 15,000 men, Brynden reported. They're well-provisioned, well-trained, and eager to fight. Lords Royce, Grafton, Waynwood, and Corbray are leading the main forces, with Lysa Arryn's blessing. She will remain in the Eyrie with Robert, but she has committed her knights. We can coordinate our marches. Robb, forcing himself to speak with a gravity beyond his years, nodded in appreciation. That's more than I hoped for, he admitted. If we move quickly, Tywin Lannister won't have time to combine his forces with Jaime's. My father's in King's Landing, But we can't just ride at once for the city, or we'd risk getting crushed between the Lannister armies. Cailin frowned. If we do nothing, Ned may die. We have to hope the threat of a united North and Vale might force the Lannisters to keep him alive as a hostage. Perhaps we can use that time to draw their forces north. Then we'll strike. The Blackfish stroked his bearded chin. Tywin's army is rumored to be in the Riverlands, causing destruction near Harrenhal. Jaime Lannister is said to be near Riverrun, besieging the Tully seat. With the Vale's forces, we can attempt to relieve Riverrun first. If we succeed, we might entice the Riverlords to rejoin our cause in greater numbers. That alone will strengthen us enough to beat either Tywin or Jaime in a field battle. Thus began the forging of a three-pronged alliance. The North, the Vale, and the Riverlands, united by familial ties and stoked by a shared hatred of the Lannisters' dominance. After finalizing their plans, Robb Stark embraced Brynden Tully as kin, and the Vale men mingled with the Northmen in camaraderie. War, they all knew, was a bleak endeavor, but there was a certain thrill in forging a bond that had so long been left dormant, overshadowed by Lysa's seclusion. The next few days saw a massive movement of troops. Robb left a small garrison to hold Moat Cailin, and the northern host marched south with grim determination. Alongside them strode the Knights of the Vale, their shining armor contrasting with the fur-lined attire of the Northmen. Axes and swords, pikes and lances, wagons and horses stretched in a line that seemed to go on forever. They would pass through the Neck, come into the Riverlands, and unite with more Vale troops who traveled by ship and overland routes to converge near Riverrun. Crossing the Neck was a test of endurance. The causeway was narrow, the bogs on either side thick with pests and hidden dangers. The Crannogmen loyal to House Reed guided the combined army through the safest routes. The presence of so many armed men in the Neck made for slow going, but the morale was high. There was no sense that they marched toward certain doom. Instead, men traded stories, shared flasks, and sang bawdy songs at night, their watchfires dotting the marshy landscape. Robb led from the front, often consulting with his bannermen and the Knights of the Vale. Where once he might have had to hide his uncertainties, now he could lean on the expertise of men like Lord Yon Royce, a seasoned veteran, or the cunning that the Blackfish possessed. Each time doubts gnawed at him, he was still little more than a boy of 15. He found renewed confidence in their unwavering support. When finally they emerged in the Riverlands, they found burned farms and blackened fields. Smoke still rose from villages that had been torched by Lannister outriders. Starving peasants clutched to the roadside, hoping for scraps of bread or a safe escort away from devastation. The sight tugged at Robb's heart, and it steeled the resolve of all. Even the proud Knights of the Vale, who had never witnessed such wanton cruelty on their mountain slopes, felt their blood boil at the injustice. News came that Riverrun was indeed under siege, albeit a partial one. Jaime Lannister held the outskirts of Tully lands, his host spread out. The Riverlords, battered and uncertain, had not fully mustered to defend their seat. Some had declared fealty to the Iron Throne, hoping to preserve their lands, while others had tried to resist in small pockets. Still, Riverrun stood, albeit precariously. Robb Stark's first major decision as a war leader was to break that siege. He intended to act quickly, hoping to catch Jaime Lannister by surprise. It was decided the Vale's main contingent would approach from the east, crossing the Red Fork of the Trident, while Robb led the northern host in a pincer from the northwest. Meanwhile, Brynden Tully would slip inside Riverrun by stealth to coordinate a sortie from within the castle. They executed the plan with precision. Under cover of darkness, the Vale Knights moved around the Lannister pickets, using old roads known to Lord Nestor Royce from his younger days. They arrived near the eastern side of Riverrun by dawn, hidden from Lannister scouts by thick copses of trees. At the same time, Robb Stark led the Northmen from the west. When the first horns sounded at sunrise, Jaime Lannister awoke to chaos. Riverrun's defenders poured out of the castle gate, led by Ser Edmure Tully, Cailin's brother, and the Blackfish. The Tully banner of the leaping trout snapped in the air. From the northern flank, war drums thundered as the Stark direwolf standard advanced with thousands of footmen. And from the eastern roads, The Knights of the Vale charged in a gleam of steel, banners of the falcon and moon shining under the early sun. Jaime's forces, momentarily caught off guard, scrambled to form lines. Knights in crimson cloaks stumbled into saddles. Foot soldiers scrambled into position. Jaime himself, golden-haired and clad in brilliant armor, rode out with a glittering sword in hand, shouting for order. The Lannisters were no raw recruits. They were formidable men who had tasted battle before. Yet their hasty defense lines could not withstand the hammer and anvil that the North and the Vale had so carefully orchestrated. The battle was swift and decisive. The Vale Knights, disciplined in their famous cavalry charges, smashed into the Lannister right flank. Foot soldiers from the north pinned the center. A hail of arrows from Tully archers rained down on Jaime's men, while the defenders of Riverrun poured forth with a cheer that echoed across the river. Trapped and outnumbered, the Lannister forces attempted to retreat, only to find themselves cut off by the pursuing knights and a host of spear-wielding Northmen. Jaime Lannister himself led a desperate sally, trying to break through the lines of the Vale Knights. He fought magnificently, slaying men left and right, deflecting lances with his shield, weaving his horse through swirling chaos. He almost succeeded in punching a hole through which his men might flee. But Bronze Yohn Royce himself stood in Jaime's path, sword in hand. The two clashed with a ringing fury of steel on steel. Jaime was the better swordsman, but he was surrounded by Royce's men. For every blade Jaime parried, two more thrust at him from an angle. In that savage moment, Ser Lyn Corbray dashed in. With a quick slash of Corbray's Valyrian steel blade, Jaime's horse was hamstrung, toppling the Kingslayer to the ground. Jaime rolled to his feet, but Vale Knights swarmed. He fought on, a deadly dance of parries and ripostes, cutting down men who came too near. Yet the weight of numbers told. Within minutes, Jaime was forced to yield, battered and pressed, or risk being cleaved in half. His bannermen, seeing their leader fall, dropped swords and spears, or tried to escape. Many were run down by the furious cavalry. Others surrendered. The siege of Riverrun ended almost before it truly began that day. The Tully banners waved proudly, and cheers resounded from the battlements. The North and the Vale had proven a lethal union. In the aftermath, Ser Edmure Tully clasped hands with Robb Stark and Bronze Yohn Royce atop the muddy battlefield, tears in his eyes. Brynden Tully nodded with grim satisfaction, but there was little time for celebration. Prisoners had to be dealt with, wounded men tended, and new strategies hatched. Catelyn Stark arrived that evening, overseeing the disposition of Jaime Lannister. She gazed upon the Kingslayer, who was bound and kneeling, blood drying on his cheek. Gone was the smug confidence, replaced by a guarded resentment. The boy who had captured him was younger than he had ever expected, and the presence of the Vale Knights had upended his assumptions. He realized too late that Lysa Arryn had intervened. Robb considered putting Jaime in chains and sending him to the north as leverage, but Catelyn insisted on confining him within Riverrun, under heavy guard. He was too valuable as a bargaining chip. Jaime refused to speak at first, though he shot barbed quips at anyone who dared question him. At length, he fell silent. Over the next few days, the combined host camped near Riverrun, replenishing supplies and ensuring the security of the riverlands. Lords of the Trident, who had been too cowed to rise before, flocked to pledge fealty to Robb Stark, or at least join the alliance out of gratitude. Walder Frey, ever the opportunist, sent word that he would remain open to negotiations. The old weasel was not prepared to stand alone against a new triumvirate of North, Vale, and Tully might. Riverrun became a nexus of power. The successful liberation of Edmure Tully's seat elevated the young Robb Stark in the eyes of friend and foe alike. Where once men might have whispered that the boy was a green commander, they now saw him as a cunning strategist. The Vale's involvement lent further prestige. No longer was Lysa Arryn's domain a sleeping giant, content to wait out the turmoil of the realm. Instead, the Vale soared into the conflict on moonlit wings. Yet a single victory, no matter how glorious, did not end the war. Tywin Lannister remained in the field, a man more dangerous than his son, with an army still sizable enough to wreak havoc. In King's Landing, Joffrey Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, guarded by the gold cloaks, the King's Guard, and the cunning of his mother, Queen Cersei. Lord Eddard Stark remained in a dungeon cell, the Queen no doubt calculating how best to use him as a pawn. The next crucial move, all agreed, was to confront Tywin Lannister before he could gather more men or retreat to a stronger position. Scouts reported that Tywin's forces had sacked various Riverrun villages and were last seen near the ruins of Harrenhal. If Robb and his allies could defeat Tywin in open battle, they command a swift end to the war, or so some optimistic lords believed. Others, including Brynden Tully, warned that Tywin was cunning, more so than Jaime, and would not be so easily outmaneuvered. Word came of another piece of news that changed the atmosphere in the Allied camp. Stannis Baratheon, the late King Robert's younger brother, had claimed that Joffrey was a product of incest between Jaime and Cersei. He demanded the Iron Throne for himself, citing the illegitimacy of the boy king. Many lords in the Stormlands began to stir, uncertain whether to declare for Stannis or to remain loyal to King Joffrey. Rumors swirled. Renly Baratheon, the youngest Baratheon brother, might also stake his claim, as he had the charisma and the backing of the powerful Tyrells. In the midst of this chaos, Robb Stark gathered his council in Riverrun's Great Hall. Edmure Tully, the Blackfish, Cailin, Lord Yohn Royce, Ser Lyn Corbray, Roose Bolton, and other Northern and Vale commanders attended. The hall's torchlight cast long shadows on the stone walls. Cailin's eyes flickered with worry. She wanted to ensure her daughters, Sansa and Arya, in King's Landing were protected, and above all, free her husband. Edmure Tully, still stiff from wounds gained in the fighting, proposed forging a direct alliance with Stannis Baratheon. If Joffrey is indeed illegitimate, we are free of any oath to the Iron Throne, he said. Stannis might be stern, but he's a man of law. He'd restore order. Robb frowned. If we declare for Stannis, we risk antagonizing Renly, who also has many allies. I've heard the Tyrells might join Renly, and that is no small power. And what of my father? If we press a new claimant's cause, the Lannisters could lash out in King's Landing, executing him as a traitor. We must consider another approach, said Brynden Tully. We can fight Tywin directly. If we defeat him, we can trade Jaime Lannister for your father. That might be the cleanest way to secure Lord Eddard's release. The Lannisters won't dare harm him if they hope to see Jaime return safe. Lord Yohn Royce stroked his thick beard. If we remain separate from the Baratheon disputes, we maintain flexibility. We must unite the entire Riverlands beneath us and destroy Tywin. Then we'll have the upper hand in any negotiations with King's Landing. A hush followed. Robb looked around the room, saw the nods of the Northmen and Vale lords. Very well, he said. We march on Tywin, and if the Seven bless us with victory, we'll name our price. The safe release of my father and the guarantee of autonomy for the North and our allies. If King's Landing refuses, we keep Jaime. The Lannisters will be forced to bargain. Cailin exhaled, a faint relief in her features. Though she worried about the risks, she could see the logic in crippling Tywin Lannister's army first. Once that formidable threat was removed, the rest might be forced to heel. So the alliance set about its next campaign. Lords of the Riverlands, newly repledged to House Tully, supplied fresh levies and guides. The roads toward Harrenhal were bleak and war-torn. Smoke rose from farmland that had not yet been reclaimed. The Red Fork's waters ran sullen. And always, the scouts kept an eye out for Tywin's outriders. Tywin himself had been informed of Jaime's capture. Enraged, he recognized that the Vale had joined the Stark cause and that the combined forces now dwarfed anything he could muster alone. He began to fall back toward the Blackwater, hoping to lure the enemy deeper into the Riverlands and possibly draw out reinforcements from King's Landing. But Cersei had her own priorities: protecting Joffrey's claim, controlling the city, and playing the Game of Thrones with Varys and Littlefinger whispering in her ear. She had no love to spare for an expensive field army. Undeterred, Robb's host advanced swiftly. Tales spread of how the boy who would be king in the north and the proud knights of the Vale marched side by side, unstoppable, to avenge wrongs done to House Stark and House Tully. Villagers greeted them with cautious gratitude. While war seldom brought joy, these men at least offered a chance at respite from Lannister depredations. Riding at the head of the Vale contingent, Lord Yon Royce's cavalry scouted the roads. One evening, word came that Tywin's outriders had been spotted crossing a ford of the Blackwater Rush. Without hesitation, Robb moved to intercept. In a cunning maneuver reminiscent of the same strategy used to free Riverrun, the Allied forces planned a pincer movement. The Northmen would block Tywin's vanguard from the northwest, while the Vale's knights circled from the southeast. But Tywin Lannister was no fool. He had scouted them, too, and quickly realized his initial plan to retreat might trap him between the Riverlands and the Crownlands. He had to either stand and fight or slip away under cover of night. Opting for caution, Tywin destroyed the main crossing behind him, setting fire to the wooden structures over the river. Then he hastily moved east, hoping to find a more defensible position. The Allied scouts followed him doggedly, and Tywin, never one to be cornered easily, led them on a chase. Days of maneuvering followed, each side trying to outsmart the other to gain a position advantage. Finally, Tywin took up a strong position near the rolling hills south of the God's Eye, where scattered farms and low ridges offered natural fortifications. There, Brynden Tully muttered, pointing across a broad sweep of farmland. Robb, Cailin, and Lord Royce gathered, their horses stamping nervously. Far in the distance, they saw the Lannister banners arrayed on the crest of a low hill, a vantage that overlooked the surrounding area. The land gently sloped up to Tywin's defensive line, dotted with hedges and ditches that farmers had used for irrigation. The setting sun gilded the banners, turning them a molten gold. "We can force him to fight or try to starve him out," offered Roose Bolton, his pale eyes glinting. "But a direct assault might be costly." Robb shook his head. "If we wait too long, he might slip away in the night, and we'll lose him in the open country. We need a decisive victory." The debate lasted until the sun sank low, staining the sky pink and violet. Ultimately, they agreed on a plan that combined caution and aggression. The Northmen would form a strong center and left flank, pushing uphill in a disciplined formation, while the Vale Knights circled to the right, using the cover of a narrow wood to ambush Tywin's flank. Brynden Tully and Edmure Tully would command archers and light cavalry to harass from the left, ensuring Tywin could not reposition easily. Morning arrived, and with it came the clash of steel. War horns echoed across the fields, and the two lions of House Lannister faced the howling wolf of Stark and the soaring falcon of Arryn. Tywin's men, though outnumbered, fought with the ferocity of cornered lions. Their lines bristled with pikes and crossbowmen. The Northmen advanced steadily, shields locked, while arrows rained. The first wave was repelled with a volley of bolts and a countercharge by Lannister cavalry. But that was only the beginning. At Robb's command, the men parted, allowing the Manderley Knights and Serwyn foot soldiers to rotate in. This disciplined approach minimized casualties and kept up pressure. On Tywin's left, the Tully archers unleashed volley after volley, preventing any flank maneuver. The Lannisters put up fierce resistance, but they were pinned to the hilltop. Suddenly, from the narrow wood on Tywin's right, the thunder of hooves erupted. Lord Yon Royce and hundreds of Vale Knights galloped out, lances lowered. The sun blazed on their polished steel, and the startled Lannisters on that flank quailed. Some died before they could even form a spear wall. The Vale cavalry crashed into their lines, splintering Lannister formations. Seeing his flank collapse, Tywin roared for his reserve to rally, but it was too late. The northern center, sensing weakness, surged forward in a furious charge. Robb Stark and Grey Wind led the infantry, the great direwolf snarls echoing in the chaos. The lines broke. Men screamed as they tumbled down the slope, trampled underfoot. Banners fell in the mud. Tywin, guarded by a small retinue of heavy horse, tried to extract himself before the entire host disintegrated. He fled downhill on the far side of the ridge, leading a handful of cavalry in a desperate bid to escape. But the Tully archers spotted them. A hail of arrows rained, felling horses and men. Tywin himself barely avoided a deadly arrow to the throat when his helm deflected it. Blood trickled from a scratch across his temple, and he pressed on, face set in cold fury. Yet, as he crested another rise, Tywin found himself confronted by none other than Ser Brynden Tully, who had led a small contingent of outriders to block any retreat. The old knight's eyes gleamed. Behind him stood a cluster of Vale knights, and the sigil of House Tully fluttered overhead. Tywin's retinue paused, uncertain. "It's over, Lannister," Brynden Tully said quietly, raising his sword. Tywin glared, mind racing with potential strategies. But the field behind him was lost. His men scattered, the Lion of Lannister undone. He was cornered, outnumbered, and the Blackfish's men looked fresh and ready. Slowly, Tywin dismounted, removing his helm, letting the battered remains of his dignity stand as a final bulwark. "I yield," he said, voice cold and clipped. The war had changed in an instant. With Tywin's capture, the allied host had netted both father and son. The Lannister army was in shambles, survivors either dead, captured, or in flight. A hush settled over the battlefield, broken by the groans of the wounded, the crackle of burning siege engines, and the cheers of victorious men. Robb Stark arrived, face smeared with dust and sweat, gray wind at his side. He looked down from his horse at Tywin Lannister, the infamous Lord of Casterly Rock. Tywin stared back, unyielding in demeanor despite his predicament. A hush fell over the onlookers. "Lord Tywin," Robb said at last, "I accept your surrender. You will be treated according to your station, but you will not be free until my father and sisters are safely returned. Should any harm befall them..." He left the threat unfinished. Tywin simply nodded, jaw clenched. He understood that his entire fate now hinged on the precarious power dynamics in King's Landing, where Cersei might well be forging other deals. In the aftermath of the battle, the allied forces celebrated, but with caution, for though they had captured the Lannisters' greatest war leaders, the war itself was not over. King's Landing and the Iron Throne remained in the hands of Joffrey Baratheon and Cersei. The gold of House Lannister, so crucial to the crown's coffers, was effectively under the Alliance's control now. But Cersei still had the City Watch, the Kingsguard, and a labyrinth of politics in her favor. Riverrun hosted a grand war council. Edmure Tully presided as Lord of the Castle, while Robb, his mother, Brynden Tully, and the Vale Lords all took their seats. Tywin Lannister remained in a secure cell, under heavy guard, while Jaime languished in a tower cell. The allied leaders sent ravens to King's Landing, listing their demands. Ned Stark must be released immediately, along with Sansa and Arya Stark, who were rumored to remain in the city. All charges of treason against Ned Stark were to be dropped. The North and the Vale would remain autonomous from the Iron Throne unless new, fair terms could be agreed upon. No further aggression was to be taken against the Tully lands, the North, or the Vale. If these demands were not met, Tywin and Jaime Lannister would face the king in the North's justice. Furthermore, the Alliance threatened to march on King's Landing if their terms were ignored. In the capital, Queen Cersei flew into a rage upon receiving the demands. She was not one to surrender her father or brother's fate so easily. Yet the strategic situation was dire. The Lannister armies in the field were effectively destroyed. The alliance of the North, Vale, and Riverlands dwarfed anything she could raise quickly from the Crownlands. Stannis Baratheon had raised his banner on Dragonstone, proclaiming himself king, and the Stormlands teetered. Renly had fled south, possibly to Highgarden, to claim the support of the Tyrells. Even Pycelle, Varys, and Littlefinger seemed uncertain how to proceed. In a closed session of the small council, Cersei raged. Joffrey, hardly more than a petulant boy, demanded they execute Eddard Stark at once, but Cersei recognized that would be tantamount to signing Tywin and Jaime's death warrants. Tyrion Lannister, newly arrived in the city after hearing of his father's capture, tried to advise negotiation, reminding the Queen that if they lost Tywin, House Lannister might never recover. But Joffrey was not a child easily guided. Hours of tense debate ensued. In the end, a message left King's Landing. announcing that Eddard Stark would be released and exiled to the north, and the Stark girls would be given safe conduct to join their father, provided Jaime and Tywin were freed. As a token of good faith, Sansa and Arya were to be escorted to Rosby, halfway out of the city, by the Kingsguard. Ned Stark would remain in the city until they arrived. Robb and Cailin read the message carefully. Mistrust ran deep. Many lords advised holding onto both Lannisters until Ned and the girls were truly safe in allied territory. Others warned of treachery, but Caitlin's maternal instincts outweighed all else. She insisted that a contingent of Vale Knights and Tully men meet the royal escort at Rosby to secure her daughters. Only once the girls were confirmed safe, she said, would the Alliance consider releasing Tywin or Jaime. Ned, she argued, might yet be at risk, but the king in the north possessed the might to avenge any betrayal. Robb agreed, though with caution. Ravens flew. Negotiations continued. A date was set for the exchange at Rosby. Sansa and Arya, terrified but clinging to hope, were led from the Red Keep under guard by a Kingsguard knight, Ser Meryn Trant, and a small cadre of Lannister guards. They traveled warily along the Rosby road, passing small villages that had seen better days. That entire stretch of land tensed at the thought of the northern host so near. Meeting them at Rosby was a large escort of Vale Knights, commanded by Ser Donnell Waynwood, along with the Blackfish and a handful of Tully men. At the same time, from the north and Vale came a separate group bearing Jaime, his hands bound but otherwise unharmed, as well as Tywin, who rode in stoic silence, flanked by men who had orders to kill him at the slightest betrayal. The exchange was tense, hearts pounding on both sides. Ser Meryn Trant, behind his white helm, eyed the archers perched behind the allied lines. The Vale Knights stood ready, their swords and lances at hand, watching for any sign of duplicity. But after a few terse words, Arya and Sansa Stark were safely handed over. Cailin, who had arrived for the exchange in person, swept her daughters into her arms, tears wet on her cheeks. For a moment, all the harshness of war melted away as mother and daughters reunited. In return, Tywin and Jaime Lannister were surrendered to the custody of Ser Meryn and the handful of Lannister guards. Yet the Alliance insisted that Ned Stark must also be safely delivered, or the Lannisters would face wrath anew. Tyrion Lannister, who arrived as a mediator, assured them that Ned would be released soon, once the Lannisters were confirmed alive and well in King's Landing. Arya tugged on her mother's sleeve, face smudged with dust. "What about father? We can't leave without him." "We won't, my sweet girl," Cailin said firmly. "We'll wait here until they keep their word." And wait they did, encamped outside Rosby, the banners of Stark, Tully, and Arryn rippling in the breeze. Tensions ran high. Everyone knew the slightest sign of treachery could spark a massacre. Inside King's Landing, Tywin Lannister reclaimed his seat on the small council, ignoring his own battered pride to focus on the question of Eddard Stark's fate. Cersei realized that with Tywin and Jaime returned alive, the immediate impetus for negotiation might lessen. But Tywin himself, mindful of House Lannister's battered position, insisted they abide by the agreement. He needed time to rebuild, to plan, to secure alliances. Killing Eddard Stark now would only bring the full fury of the North and the Vale upon King's Landing. Thus, 1 week later, Lord Eddard Stark was brought to Rosby, escorted by a doubled retinue of gold cloaks. Pale and thinner, but unbroken in spirit, Ned dismounted from his horse with a weary but resolute bearing. The moment Cailin saw him, she ran forward, tears in her eyes, as did Sansa and Arya. They embraced him tightly. Ned's voice trembled with relief and love. The watchers looked on with a sense of awe, as if witnessing a miracle. After all the rumors of Ned Stark's impending execution, to see him alive, free, and reunited with his family under the watchful eyes of the entire Northern Vale host felt surreal. Lord Eddard managed a grateful nod toward Robb, who stood back, letting his father have a moment. The boy who had led armies and captured Lannisters now found himself just a son relieved to see his father unharmed. A single question remained, overshadowing all else. What now? The Alliance had gained its prime objective, Lord Eddard Stark's freedom and the rescue of the Stark daughters. They had crippled House Lannister's field armies. The realm was in turmoil, with Stannis and Renly each plotting to seize the throne. The question of northern independence and Vale autonomy remained, or whether they should remain a united front in the conflicts to come. Robb called another council, this time at Rosby itself. Ned, still regaining his strength, attended. Cailin, the Blackfish, lords from the north, Vale, and Tully houses gathered in a large command tent pitched in a meadow behind the small castle's walls. The flags of the dire wolf and the falcon fluttered side by side, joined by the leaping trout of Tully. Night fell, and torches lit the faces of the gathered lords. Ned, voice hoarse but carrying authority, began. "You have done me a great service by freeing me. You have risked your lives and the lives of your men, all in the name of honor and justice. I will not forget it, nor will the North. Yet the Iron Throne remains in the hands of a boy king whose claim is overshadowed by rumors of illegitimacy, supported by a family whose armies we have humiliated." Lord Yohn Royce spoke up. "Shall we press on to King's Landing, place the city under siege, and remove Joffrey Baratheon? We outnumber any force Cersei can gather." Ned shook his head. "The city is well fortified, and a siege might cost countless lives. Moreover, we do not seek the throne ourselves. Do we want a war that will engulf the realm for years, or do we want peace for our people?" Roose Bolton's cool voice intruded. "Peace will only come if we remove the Lannister threat entirely, my lord. They are beaten now, but if we give them time, they will rebuild." A heavy silence followed. Ned's eyes shifted to his son, Robb, who had effectively been acting as the North's leader. Robb inhaled deeply. "We have an advantage. House Lannister is weakened, but to press the city is to risk more bloodshed. Our men are weary, our supplies taxed. If Stannis and Renly each come with armies of their own, the city could turn into a battleground from three sides. Perhaps we can negotiate a settlement, though." Lord Royce frowned. "Negotiate with Tywin Lannister? He is not a man known for compromise. But we have proven we will not be trifled with," Cailin said. "We have hammered his forces, and with Father and Jaime in captivity he was forced to submit. He knows our strength now. We can secure terms that protect the North and the Vale." Brynden Tully pointed out that the Riverlands could not easily forget the depredations House Lannister had brought upon them. He, too, desired some manner of guarantee that the Tully lands would be safe in the future. Ned leaned forward, voice resolute. "My first duty is to my people, to the North. We have bled too long in this war that started with the lies about my kingly friend Robert's children. I will consider any path that grants the North safety and sees my household return to Winterfell. I have no desire to wear a crown, nor to see my son do so. The Vale must make its own decisions." Lord Yohn Royce exchanged glances with the other Vale lords, seeing a mixture of opinions. Some wanted to press their advantage, others wanted to return to the Eyrie. The memory of how they had first marched, the daring choice that soared in the face of Lysa's initial hesitation, remained fresh. They had come far from the days of neutrality. In the end, Ned proposed a compromise. "We will send envoys to King's Landing to treat for peace. We will demand official pardons, recognition of the North's and the Vale's rights, and restitution for the Riverlands. If the Crown refuses, or if the Lannisters attempt to recoup their losses through deceit, then we will consider more forceful action." The assembled lords agreed, though some with reluctance. That night, as the fires burned low, Ned Stark walked beneath the stars, reflecting on how close he had come to death. He thought of Robert Baratheon and Jon Arryn, their memory overshadowed by so much strife. He silently thanked the old gods that Lysa Arryn had found the will, or had been pressed by her lords, to join the North. Had the Vale not intervened, Ned might have died in King's Landing, Sansa and Arya might be prisoners still, and the war might have been an endless nightmare. A few days later, the host began its march north and east. Ned sought to return to Winterfell, if only briefly, to ensure the seat of House Stark was secure. Cailin accompanied him, along with Sansa and Arya, and a portion of the northern lords. Robb remained at Riverrun for a time, helping Edmure Tully restore order. The Vale Knights, though, had begun the journey homeward. Some parted ways from the Starks in the Riverlands, promising future cooperation if war flared again. Others escorted Ned as far as the Bloody Gate, ensuring that no Lannister remnants threatened the route. As the lords parted ways, there was a sense of triumphant camaraderie in the ranks. They had done what many deemed impossible, broken the Lannisters' hold on the Riverlands, captured both Jaime and Tywin, and secured Lord Stark's release. In the north, peasants cheered Robb's name. Even in the Vale, songs sprouted of the gallant knights riding forth to smash the lion's claws. None could predict how the future might unfold. Stannis Baratheon's righteous claim, Renly's rebellious ambition, the Tyrell's strength, the Iron Island's opportunism, and Dorne's watchful patience all added threads to an ever more tangled tapestry. But for the moment, House Stark and House Arryn stood victorious. Winterfell greeted Ned Stark's return with wide eyes and open arms. Bran, newly crippled from his mysterious fall, wept upon seeing his father. Rickon, too young to understand fully, clung to Ned's leg. The northern lords who had traveled home with him exhaled in relief, happy to see the seat of the north remain stable. Ned quickly began reinforcing the castle's defenses and seeing to the welfare of the people. War had drained resources, but the end was not quite in sight. Merely the worst danger had abated. Meanwhile, Lysa Arryn, still perched in the eyrie, received her returning knights with something akin to stunned disbelief. They brought tales of battles won, glory earned, and the satisfaction of having been vital to freeing Lord Eddard Stark. She feigned pride and acceptance, though inside she harbored misgivings. She worried that the Vale's involvement would draw further entanglements in the future. But public sentiment in the Vale soared. House Arryn's lords rode through villages hailed as heroes, their banners waving, and few men doubted that the Vale's timely alliance with the North had changed the course of the war. Back in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister set about reasserting control over the court. Though forced to negotiate with the North and Vale, he wasted no time in strengthening King Joffrey's position, intimidating potential traitors, and re-establishing the crown's finances. He had only just tasted defeat on the battlefield, but his real weapon was political cunning. He would not easily let the Starks or Arryns rest in peace. For the moment, though, he bided his time, focusing on the immediate threats: Stannis and Renly. On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon took note of the developments in the Riverlands. He recognized that with the Lannisters weakened, the king in the north might be an asset or an obstacle. Meanwhile, Renly, from Highgarden, courted Margaery Tyrell and an alliance that could see him crowned in the eyes of the Reach. Both men eyed the north and Vale with caution, uncertain which way they might tilt. Thus the realm stood in a precarious peace that was no peace at all. The War of the Five Kings had not ended, for only one king had actually declared himself so far: Joffrey Baratheon. Rumors said that Stannis was about to declare, or already had, while Renly soon would. Some even whispered that Robb Stark might still claim the North as an independent kingdom if pushed. Yet, in truth, the unity between the North and the Vale, along with the renewed strength of House Tully, had created a formidable coalition that no rival king could ignore. Robb Stark remained in the Riverlands for several weeks, forging deeper ties with the local lords, ensuring that Walder Frey, who was always cunning, stayed in line. He respected Walder's control of the twins but made sure that the man understood the consequence of betrayal. No small threat when an allied army that large could crush him. The Freys, sniffing out advantage, pledged loyalty to House Stark, though many suspected they would change sides if the wind shifted again. In the Vale, Bronze Yohn Royce returned to his seat at Runestone, proud of what had been accomplished. Lyn Corbray, flush with the thrill of battle, boasted of his part in capturing Jaime. The Graftons in Gulltown thrived, as trade resumed and the war seemed to draw more commerce to their port. Some knights who had seen the horrors of conflict for the first time found themselves haunted by nightmares, but they consoled themselves with the knowledge that their swords had freed Lord Stark. Sansa, once so enamored of the South's romantic ideals, found her illusions shattered. She remained in Winterfell with her family, her admiration for Joffrey replaced by a deep anger at his cruelty and deceit. Arya, though relieved to be home, bristled at the quiet life and wondered if her sword needle would ever taste real battle. She had seen too much in King's Landing to return to girlish pursuits. Cailin guided her daughters, though she too had been changed. The image of Ned, imprisoned and near death, haunted her. The memories of capturing Jaime, seeing the North and Vale armies clash with the Lannisters, all lingered. Her faith in the Seven comforted her some nights, but she remained wary that this temporary lull might break at any moment, plunging them all back into the furnace of war. Ned Stark spent time in the Godswood, bent over the still waters, whispering prayers to the old gods. He felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever before. The knowledge of what had happened in King's Landing, the revelations about Joffrey, the question of how best to preserve peace, it all churned in his mind. He knew that if the realm continued to fracture, a savage war would consume it. Thousands more would die, winter would come, and the hungry would starve. It seemed only the faintest glimmer of hope that House Stark's alliance with the Vale could provide a stabilizing force, a possibility to counter the might of any one claimant who tried to force a bloody path to the Iron Throne. As the harvest months slipped by, envoys from Stannis and Renly each arrived in Winterfell, requesting audience with Lord Stark. Similarly, ravens from the Eyrie arrived urging a unified approach. Clearly, the other claimants recognized that an alliance with House Stark and House Arryn could tilt the balance. Ned listened politely to Stannis' envoy, who spoke of the law, the darkness in the south, and Stannis' unwavering right to rule. Renly's messenger came with promises of a bright future, generous terms, and the backing of the Reach's abundant resources. Ned conferred at length with Robb, who had returned from the Riverlands for the winter. The boy was older in spirit now, each victory etched into his bearing, each burden adding lines to his brow. They debated the merits of an alliance with either Baratheon brother, or neither or both. Could they unify Stannis and Renly? That seemed impossible, given the bitterness that lay between them. Stannis would never cede precedence to a younger brother, and Renly believed the realm would not rally behind his grim elder sibling. In the Vale, the lords also argued amongst themselves. Some admired Stannis' stern sense of justice. Others preferred Renly's charm and perspective strength. Lisa Arryn herself vacillated, uncertain of which course protected her son most securely. Brynden Tully kept a neutral stance, focusing on the security of the Riverlands. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister, named Hand of the King by his father, struggled to hold the capital together. Cersei fumed at the concessions forced upon them, but she needed the North and Vale neutral, or at least not openly hostile, lest the city be stormed. So for the moment, uneasy truces were maintained, hinged on old grudges and new manipulations. As the first snows of the northern winter fell on Winterfell, Ned Stark stood atop the battlements, gazing at the white lands beyond. The knowledge that winter was coming pressed heavily on him. He recalled the bitter fates of those who warred against the North in winter. An entire generation ago, the Targaryen dynasty had fallen. Now the Baratheon line seemed set to tear itself apart. House Lannister had been dealt a blow, but they were far from finished. In that hush of white, Ned could almost imagine a different world. One where Robert Baratheon and Jon Arryn still lived, a world where the Vale never had to ride south, and the North never had to raise swords. Yet the gods had woven a different tapestry, and in that tapestry, House Stark was intertwined with House Arryn, forging a bond that had freed him from King's Landing and shattered the Lannisters' might. If not for the Vale, Ned mused, the North would stand alone, battered. If not for the North, the Vale might have remained cowering behind its mountains until the day the war spilled over them. Perhaps, he thought, that bond of old, where Eddard Stark, Robert Baratheon, and Jon Arryn had once stood shoulder to shoulder, was not wholly lost. It had found new expression in Robb, in the Knights of the Vale, in the Riverlords who had followed House Tully. Perhaps, with caution and wisdom, it could shepherd the realm to a more peaceful outcome. Robb joined his father on the walls. The wind tousled his auburn curls, and behind him gray wind padded, sniffing the cold air. Father and son looked across the quiet, snow-shrouded courtyard. Sansa and Arya played with Rickon on a patch of cleared ground, building lumps of snow shaped vaguely like direwolves. A hush fell between them, father and son, each lost in thought. Finally, Ned said, "You've done well, Robb. I am proud of you, but you have taken on burdens no boy your age should bear." Robb glanced at the horizon. "They call me the young wolf," he said quietly, "but I feel old inside. I keep thinking about the men I led, those who died on the battlefield. I see their faces at night." Ned placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Such is the price of war. We must do everything we can to spare our people from more bloodshed. But if war is forced upon us again, we must face it united. The North and the Vale, the Riverlands, we are stronger together, as we have seen." Robb nodded, blinking against the swirl of snow. Do you think we did the right thing, father? We won your sisters back, your mother's peace of mind, and my own freedom," Ned said gently. "And we defended our allies." "Yes, I think so. We must remain vigilant, but we have given our family a chance to endure. In these times, that is more precious than gold." They fell silent again, watching the quiet swirl of snowflakes. Each had their private fears for the future of Stannis, of Renly, of a resurgent Lannister power. But for once, they had time to plan, time to breathe. The Vale had soared alongside the wolf, and the lion lay wounded. Though the realm might bleed again, at least for now, the North had reclaimed its lord, and the Vale had proved its valor. For a brief moment in Westeros, hope and respite flickered like a candle flame in the long night, fed by the memory of old friendships and the promise that, when men of honor join hands against the darkness, they can rewrite the fate of kingdoms. And so they had, in that autumn of war, forging a new chapter in the Song of Ice and Fire, one in which the Knights of the Vale rode south from the start, turning the tide before the storms of the Seven Kingdoms grew too wild to tame.